Hello. Wait a few minutes. See if a few people log in. I will start talking. Pull it up on my computer here too. There it is. So we had this idea to start a couple of chats like this, based on the idea that we do these all the time actually with students. This is something we do a lot at SOCI. We kind of hang out in a room together. One of the four of us, starts talking about a subject. After about 10 or 15 minutes of talking about that subject, things go on all kinds of tangents. Students especially have a lot of things that they want to talk about. And we really enjoy it. So I had this thought that maybe this is something we could do online, or at least try it out. So I'm here in my basement, at my wife's piano actually. It's you can see some of our books and music behind us. And yeah, I don't know. I just thought it would be fun. I think in the future, all of us from So will probably do some of these. We'll talk about different areas, different things that we're into, different things that we like to focus on or talk about. And it would be fun if people have ideas for what that could be. Sorry, my laptop over here as well. People have ideas for what that could be, or questions or anything like that. That's really great. We just thought it would be fun to kind of do the process that we do sometimes in closed rooms with master classes or with SOCI sessions, and try doing it online and see. So I certainly don't mind talking about something that I enjoy for a while, so I thought I could start there. And so the idea that we had to start was to talk about the idea of collaboration, which is actually obviously an incredibly broad thing to talk about. You know, it's an issue that comes up for every musician, and it's also a bit of a buzzword right now, and so you hear it thrown around. It's part of kind of like Silicon Valley, you know, group speak. It's part of the way a lot of people say, oh yeah, we collaborate, it's collaborative, everything's collaborative. And that's great, actually. But we have a pretty specific way of thinking about it in So Percussion, and especially with regard to the way that we work with composers. I think that in a lot of ways, when you do something that is collaborative across different disciplines, that's a little bit more obvious in terms of how it fits into the collaborative buzzword, right? You're like, oh, we're this, and we're working with that, and so we're collaborating, and that is a huge part of the collaboration we do. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but first I wanted to talk about collaborating with composers, actually, and that's when I've asked people on Facebook, like, what would be interesting for one of these talks. They've said, well, what is your process? What is So's process with composers? How does that work? And I guess what interests me about it, and by the way, I want to say if anybody has a question at any point, you can just type it in here. I'm seeing them and I can address them as I'm going. I don't mind giving lectures, but it's also fun to respond to ideas that people have. That working with a composer, I think there's been a tendency sometimes to think of that as a very transactional process. And when you think of commissioning people, I mean, it is literally a transactional process, right? You pay somebody for a piece and your roles are defined. They're the creator, you're the interpreter. But we like to mess that up a little bit. We like to mess with that, the clearly defined roles in that process. Excuse me. And that is fun to do, but you actually have to be a little bit careful about it too, and you have to have some confidence in what your role is, what your strengths are, and what the strengths are of the composer. And more than anything, you have to develop a relationship. For us, we really believe that the best work, the best pieces of new music come out of good relationships, just people relationships between us and composers. All of the best pieces that have been written for us have been because we have developed a relationship with a composer and we trust each other. So what does that look like? For us, it essentially, you know, it starts as the process of just talking about what it might be. So with percussion, you have this issue of, sorry, didn't turn off all my notifications. You have this issue of, well, what's it even going to be? Like literally, what instruments are you going to play? What sounds are you going to make? I mean, percussion, I think more than anything, or maybe that's just my percussion-centric thinking, percussion is an area where more than any other, you start not even knowing where to start, not even knowing what it's going to be. And that's exactly where you start with the composer. So that level of collaboration starts from the very beginning. What's it going to be? What are we going to do? Or what even instruments do you want me to pick up and start playing? In some cases, we have composers who, ask us to, either they or we create a brand new sound that's never existed before in the specific way they're thinking of it. And so we start with an idea that's unproven about what it might sound like. And none of that kind of thinking for us fits into the kind of transactional mentality of like, you're that person, we're these people, you write, we play, okay, see you later. It never works for us. It always has to be this very involved thing. And one of the things I was thinking about when I thought about how I wanted to talk about this is that you actually, as much as there needs to be give and take, the foundation for that is both of you starting with a pretty strong identity and a pretty strong sense of what your strengths are and what you think you bring to the table. We as a group, I've been playing in the group for 16 years now. We've been touring for 16 or 17, almost since I started. And we have a pretty well-defined kind of culture, pretty well-defined strengths. Sorry, again, notifications. Pretty well-defined strengths. And when we come together with a composer, they have a tendency, which is great, to say, oh, this is what I know of you and this is what I've seen you do. And that for us can be a launching point of like, yeah, that works great. That's, we like to play rhythmic music. We like to do counterpoint and hocketing, things like that. But actually, it's also fun if they say, well, but I actually have an idea that's a little different than that. Is that going to work? We might say, oh, yeah, well, I did a lot of music in school that used that technique. I'm comfortable engaging with that. Or, yeah, let's push it. You can push us in a certain kind of direction. And again, that's where the relationship aspect comes in. So when we start together like that, it doesn't just start in a completely, we have no direction, we have no idea what's going on kind of place, because each of us know about the other. We've asked the composer to write for us, so we know about them, and they have some sense about us. One of the most important things for us as an ensemble, and this can be really difficult to do, I kind of preach this all the time, and I've been involved in many discussions online about it. It's important not to... So you commission a composer because presumably you like what they've done before. And this is something I think that people fall into all the time. And I think especially classical musicians who have spent most of their lives playing fixed works written by people who are dead, and so the pieces are not going to change, and you know what they are. They're a kind of known quantity. You have a tendency to be like, okay, I know this other stuff you've written. It would be really great if we more or less just got some version of that for us, so we kind of know what we're getting, because the risk and the unknowns of like, what could this be, is a little scary sometimes. I really discourage people from dealing with composers that way, or from approaching them that way. It can be very inhibiting for composers. Now, I think some composers, they purposely have a pretty focused style, partially as a way of navigating the world of commissioning and having their music all over the place. And so it may work out that you have a pretty strong sense of what you're going to get. Some composers, when they're inspired, when they're in a trusting relationship with a performer, do completely unexpected things. And I would say that we, as an ensemble, we live for those unexpected moments. We like them. But the only way to get to them is if you're in a relationship with the composer where you can kind of encourage that sort of thinking, and you can sort of support them by saying, we believe in you as a composer. We're not necessarily looking for you to manufacture something that's already known. We just think you're interesting. And in the end, a lot of them will make something that's consistent with what they made before, because they have a style and an approach and all of that. But we find that, especially for percussion, although I think that this would apply to other instruments too, if you leave it a little more open than that, you can really be surprised. But then the sort of counterpoint to that in terms of the collaborative relationship is that you leave things open like that, but then you as an interpreter, as a performer, can offer to remain and to be really involved from that point. So if you as a performer feel nervous about this idea of, yeah, it could be a lot of things, let's open it up. Part of your relationship with the composer is, yeah, but let's keep at it. Let's work on it together. So what we all really encourage performers to do and to think of is to then from that point be enthusiastic, to be engaged, and to define the process in as positive terms as possible. So I would say, like, here's a way of portraying how we think about, you're working with a composer, they have some ideas, they've thrown the ideas at you, you're either trying them in the room or you're looking at them in a sketch. How do you deal from that point? I'll tell you how we deal, and doesn't have to be this way for everybody. You try to portray things in as positive terms as possible. Part of what that means is, so you might be getting something that isn't working. It's actually not super helpful to say, this isn't working, because that's not specific information. There's nothing the composer can do with that. They're like, okay, thanks, I guess. What's a lot more helpful is to say, is to take what they've given you. So say it's a sketch. You take the sketch, you play it, you do your best, and maybe, first of all, maybe it's evident that something isn't working, but it's because of your best effort, not because the first thing you did when getting it is be like, oh, no, this won't work. You actually try it, and the composer, 9 times out of 10, will be like, that's not totally working, is it? And you can be like, well, some things, I'm struggling with some things. So saying things like, I'm struggling with some things, or I'm trying to make this work, but I'm having these issues. If that's, first of all, if you're doing that during a collaborative process, the stakes and the pressure are much lower than if all you've done is order a piece, you get your piece, and then things aren't working, and you're about to premiere. Or what happens to a lot of composers is you find out that things aren't working in the premiere. That's not a great feeling. So if it's during the collaborative process, the pressure is much lower, and the composer can be like, oh, okay, cool, let me try something else and get it back to you. So we always have, as much as possible, we offer ourselves for many iterations of sketches, of revisions, of different ideas and trying different things. One of the reasons for that is because percussion is very difficult to predict on the page what's going to happen, what it's going to sound like, what it's going to feel like in an acoustic space, and the composer usually really needs to have that. One example, which this to me is kind of a fascinating example, and this is one that I talk to students about a lot, so if you've been in our classes, you might have heard this story before, but working with Steve Reich on his piece Mallet Quartet. Steve is a very collaborative composer. All of the early works that he did came out of a process of working with his musicians, like the original members of Nexus, Russell Hartenberger, and folks like that. And a lot of those early works were not pen to paper at all, actually, for a long time. They were like, try this, try that, okay, we'll build this on top, now let's see what happens when you phase, let's see what happens when you fade out. However, by the time he wrote for us and several other groups in 2009, I mean, my feeling was, this is Steve Reich, we're so lucky to even be involved with him at all. But I thought, well, but it couldn't hurt. I mean, we had a relationship with him. I thought, well, it couldn't hurt to just say, hey, we're here for you, and we like to collaborate. And I mean, we're nobody, you're Steve Reich, so maybe that's ridiculous, but we're at least willing. So I saw him at I think it was a Bang on a Can benefit, and the commission was in place, and we were in New York, and he was nearby, and I just walked up to him and I said, we're so delighted to be a part of this. We're happy to help in any way. If there's any new ideas, if you want to try out any sketches or anything like that. And he was, in his like very typical kind of fast-moving, fast-talking way, was like, oh, actually, yeah, okay, that would be great. I've never written for 5-octave marimba before. I have absolutely no idea what it's going to sound like. Do you have one of those? And I was like, yes. Steve Reich, who I can't believe I'm talking to. He was like, okay, great. So I'm gonna come up with some ideas, some sketches. I'm gonna send them to you. You're gonna record them and you're gonna send them back to me. And I was like, okay, Steve Reich, sounds good. And so just the offer of collaboration and just the enthusiasm, even with somebody who in my field was, to me, the most famous, notable, important musician I could possibly be talking to, to him it was evident that that would be a good idea. And so we went through a process of emailing back and forth. He emailed sketches. And it was very fun and funny. Like his emails were really funny. I would try something and send it back, and he would be like, "Oh, that doesn't work at all. Okay, I'm going to change it." And so in the end, in this piece, Mallet Quartet, the low sonorities in the 5-octave marimba, it's a small thing, right? But they're a result of this process. And what he ended up doing is writing these very beautiful sonorities that have these kind of open fifth voicings in the lowest voices, which anybody who plays marimba and percussion knows is a common feature of Musser etudes and a lot of writing, because it just sounds good there. And the bottom part of the 5-octave marimba doesn't sound like a piano, doesn't sound like any other instrument. And it's a direct result of this process. There was no particular amazing genius that on my part in that process. It was simply just saying, hey, can we do this? Or I'm willing to help, or I'm willing to be involved. So in that case, even with that little bit of collaboration, a lot of the ideas for the work were still fixed by the composer himself. He was like, I'm going to write for this, for 2 marimbas and 2 vibraphones and all of that kind of stuff. But with many other composers, it's a long time before any of that gets fixed. What the sounds are going to be, what what the kind of scale of the piece is going to be. So a different example is working with Bryce Dessner, who's a really terrific composer. He's a guitarist and a songwriter in the band The National. He went to the Yale School of Music at the same time that some of us were there, so it's a long relationship with him. And in that case, he actually invented a brand new instrument, an instrument called chord stick, which is a hybrid instrument, sort of played like hammered dulcimers, laid flat, but it's sort of mic'd up. It has a guitar neck with pegs, and it's mic'd up like an electric guitar. And this was something none of us would have thought of, but it actually plays to his strengths as a guitarist. And he had Aaron Sanchez from Buchan Gase fabricate the instruments. So the kind of trust situation there was never going to be the transactional thing of us being like, Bryce Dessner, write this piece for us and invent a brand new instrument that we've never heard of or tried before. None of that was going to happen in a transactional way. It was all very fluid. He was like, can I try this? And we were like, yeah, absolutely. He invented the instrument, he had them made, he brought them to us, and we started improvising together with them so that he could see what they felt like and what they sounded like. And that happened for a while. And then he sent sketches, and we tried some sketches. And then even when the quote-unquote final piece came to us, and I really give Bryce credit for this, the final piece came to us, and he was like, it's like maybe 75% or 80% there, and I'd like to see what you guys can add after that point. And we were like, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we never shy away when a composer asks a question like that. Sorry, I'm just, oops, wait, there we go. So for us, that's always been yeah, absolutely. Let's do that. And then what we ended up adding the most to it was sort of percussion tricks. There was a moment where we thought, well, these are like guitars and they're amplified, so maybe we could hook up distortion pedals and do all of this kind of stuff with it. And we were like, what would be really fun is just to use the orchestral percussion tricks and see what kind of different sounds we could get out of it. So we play the piece with pencils, and one side has the metal part that holds the eraser, and the other side is just the normal wooden side, and if it's unsharpened, it's just a wooden end. So we toyed around with, wrapped moleskin around one end to create a soft side, and then we had a hard side so you could flip them back and forth and get different timbres. There was all this plucking, or, the leño, the wooden side of the bow, all of these kinds of things. We ended up using all acoustic and natural sort of sounds and ideas on this electronic instrument. So for the whole 40-minute long piece, all of the changes that happen with timbre and stuff like that, that was us with him kind of fiddling around with those things. So both of those pieces, I was bringing those pieces up because both of them are kind of contemporary classical pieces where you have a composer who's commissioned and you have the ensemble who interprets. But all of these degrees and options for fluidity exist there. And our approach is every time we're commissioning a composer, and they don't always want to have like tons of fluidity. Sometimes they kind of want to work in their world and give you the piece. And that's totally fine. But we always make that offer of like, let's do as much together as possible. So, see, I told you I'm happy to talk. By the way, anybody has any questions at any point, I can see the little comments here. I'm happy to answer questions. That, you sort of get to a point where you're doing this back and forth with composers, and the kind of issue comes up of like, okay, well, fluidity is good, but don't you need some confidence and experience in order to know, like, where's my territory and where's your territory? Because it's not necessarily something where you want to be, as a performer, where you want to be commenting on everything the composer's doing, or there's certain areas where you don't want to pass judgment or sort of get too much in their business. I would say the easy way to kind of know what and how to do that is anything that has to do with like what notes should be on the page in terms of like compositional structure, the language, the musical language that the composer uses, like the pitch language and stuff like that. We pretty much stay out of their hair when it comes to stuff like that, because that is their territory. We ask them to write a piece, right? Like we write pieces, so if we want the pitches to be ordered in a certain way, like we could just write our own pieces. We kind of stay out of their hair on that stuff. But when it comes to things that are more obviously in our wheelhouse, like what it feels to set up a certain setup, what it feels like to play a certain instrument, what it's sounding like as we're trying it, things like the economy of a setup. Many composers we've talked to, and percussion setups can get really big sometimes, and that can be really cool. There are these James Wood pieces that are really cool pieces that like take up an entire stage and take like 2 hours to set up, and they're like 10 minutes of music, which for us as a touring group, like we actually wanted to play some of those pieces when we first started as a touring group, and we were just like, oh my God, we can't possibly do this. But we talk to composers about stuff like that, and we just put it as a range of options. We say, we're a touring group. If we have some economy in the setups, we can more easily play this piece more often. One of the reasons we play Steve Reich's music all the time is not just because of all these artistic reasons, which are there as well, but he wrote a lot of these pieces while he was touring, being like, oh my gosh, I need more pieces that are easier to tour. Clapping music is an obvious one, music for pieces of wood. Even the first movement of drumming, the bongos are really easy to take around. I think sometimes people may or may not realize that a lot of playing that music is just like because we can. I mean, because it's easy to take them around and play them. So we talk to composers and we say, no, we don't say to them, well, if you don't do this or that, we'll never be able to tour it, or you have to make it this or you have to make it that. We never talk in declaratives, pretty much ever. It's always things like, well, it would be easier to, or when we tour, when we talked to Polanski about writing threads, we said, 2 vibraphones are pretty easy to get a hold of in most places. If that's something that makes sense to you, that could be a relatively smooth way to think about touring. And he was really up for that. He wanted to go back and forth a lot to figure out this issue of what makes it easy to play, what makes touring possible, that kind of stuff. But so those things are in our wheelhouse, and we feel confident saying to a composer, let's talk about setups, let's talk about making a piece easy to tour, and that kind of stuff. We never say to them, did you really mean A flat there? I don't think that would be a pretty obvious, that would be a transgression in the relationship, and it would make the composer feel a little like, oh, they don't like what I'm doing. They don't like what I'm writing. We try to stay away from that kind of stuff. So that's the like composer performer thing. We try not to think about transactional. We try to think about fluid, but at the same time, you want to ground yourself in a pretty solid sense of, well, who are we in the relationship and who is this other person, the composer? So I also wanted to talk a little bit about other kinds of collaborations that are not composer-performer, but that are sometimes cross-disciplinary. And it's kind of timely for us right now because we're working with choreographer Susan Marshall, who's really amazing. She teaches at Princeton, and we also now for the last few years have been ensemble in residence at Princeton. And Jason Truding from our group has been working with her for a little while. Many friends of ours like David Lang have worked with her. She's amazing. And we started doing this piece that we're actually tonight at the APAP conference. We're doing a showing of it, a showing of a chunk of it. And the idea was to kind of push the collaborative idea or model pretty far in terms of what do we do and what do you do. So instead of like, I'm going to have dancers dance and you guys play percussion, she gets us onto the stage, and all of the sound score and all of the music that's happening is part of the movement on stage. I can paint a picture really quickly. Basically, we have these 3 panels against the back of the stage, and 3 of us walk back and forth to the panels, and the other person, who happens to be Josh, takes bits of tape, puts them on the panels, and we have microphones in our hands the whole time, and speakers down on the ground. And when we get to the tape, we have to play whatever is on the tape. So if it's a dot, you play a dot, and you may play it rhythmically. If it's a strip, you might kind of scrape it like a guiro, and then you hear that through the microphone. So the entire score gets painted on stage with the tape on the panels by Josh, and the rest of us are walking back and forth and playing this tape. And it comes out of an idea that happened in one of Susan's earlier pieces called Play Pause. And it's a really great idea. And so the thought was, well, she's had people doing this, she's had dancers doing this before. What would it be like? What would a So Percussion piece with the tape and the microphone and focusing on the musical elements be like? And it's really fun. But for us, it's also really challenging because it means that we are dancers now, that the movement component is something that we are having to deal with in a real way. And so for what we're showing tonight at APAP, she also has 3 dancers that kind of match or mirror the 3 of us who are percussionists. And the conversation is constantly happening about, well, what are their strengths here on stage? Because they're doing all this incredible, athletic, dance-oriented stuff, dance vocabulary stuff that none of us could do. So obviously we're not going to be trying to do that. What are our strengths? Once we're at the tape, making music, playing composite rhythms together, that's strong. We do like to think about how we move on stage. We do feel comfortable with that, but for the most part, we're kind of walking. We're task and purpose oriented with what we're doing. We're not trying so hard to kind of go in their territory, although there are some moments where we're crawling around on the floor and stuff. Those kind of collaborations, it's the same process as with composers in terms of this idea of fluidity and also kind of knowing where I'm coming from and knowing where you're coming from and how can we bring our strengths to the table and how can we augment each other's strengths. One of the things that's most challenging for me about it is that the way that choreographers often work, and of course they're all different, growing up as a classical musician, the idea of that a lot of it is already there on the page via the score, and I'm supposed to just kind of decode the score and go from there. My brain is still pretty oriented that way, even though I do a lot of new collaborations. And for many, probably most choreographers, you compose on the bodies of the people in the room in real time. And so you try something, you see it, and you say, and she says, okay, try this, try that. You see the new picture of the new thing that's happening. And for me, having no score, so actually Jason kind of teases me because the way I figured out how to deal with this process for myself is I walk around with a notebook and I'm like furiously scribbling and actually making a score for myself as we're going, like this happens, then that happens, then that happens. And then when something changes, I scribble it out and I write, no, okay, now this is happening, now that is happening. It really helps my brain because what they're doing, and the dancers are used to doing that, is that she says, try this, try this, try that, run it, it happens, and she's like, let's change this, let's change that, and then after that happens, let's change that, okay, now run that. And now if you play a lot of music that's taught by rote or involves improvisation, you might be more used to that, and I have done some of that, but you know, I'm pretty classical the way that my brain works, and so for me, it's just like I have to keep writing down all the things that are changing. Moments like that are challenging in a collaboration that is across boundaries of discipline like that. And you can choose to deal with that one of two ways. You can say, okay, this is a unique challenge for me, and I'm giving you my best stuff. Or you can, and frankly, I've seen this happen a lot of times, you can become kind of defensive and insecure and be like, oh, I don't do that. Or you know, that's not me. I don't work that way. I'm not comfortable working that way. What are you doing? And I don't know. I don't see how that approach, I don't see where that gets you in the end. For me, it's much more interesting, and you know, I have to push myself sometimes, but it's much more interesting to be like, okay, I can do this. Let's figure out what this means. So anyway, that's where I kind of find that you can go all the way from what we think of as normal kind of musician land of a composer and performer relationship, all the way into, you know, cross-disciplinary thinking. And frankly, working on a score by, frankly, a dead person, I actually see it as some version of this that's along this spectrum somewhere. The thing is, it's a one-way conversation. That's the only problem with it, right? Is you can't get any feedback from them. But that doesn't mean you can't think of it like it's a kind of, like when you read a really great book, right? You're not just passively getting the information. You're like kind of dealing with, and sometimes you're kind of like, in your mind, you're kind of yelling at the author, like, what do you think? Why are you doing that? Or you're making me feel this way. Or I think we all do that, right? It's not just me. Okay. You can do that even with a piece written by somebody who's not alive anymore. You can have the mindset of somebody who's in a fluid process, working, going back and forth. And then actually you can have a lot more fun with that person's work than if you're like, this is a fixed thing, it has a whole precedent, and I'm just supposed to kind of deal with it. It's a terrible feeling. That's a terrible way to feel while you're making something creative. So in my mind, any kind of work you make with any kind of creator is part of this process of being fully engaged and thinking of it as a back and forth, whether to what extent that is actually possible or not. So anyway, yeah, okay, that's that. I do these kind of impromptu lectures sometimes. We have some folks watching. If anybody has a question, I'd be really most welcome to take questions and answer them. I'll take a sip of my coffee while I'm doing that. There's a bit of a delay, so I'll give it a second. Make sure I have the setting on my thing where I can see them. I'm going to write a test comment to make sure I can see them. Test. Yes, I can. Hi, Jason. You just missed my whole lecture, Jason. I'm waiting for questions right now. All right, Bueller. Yeah, no worries. I could keep talking for a little bit because I like talking. Oh, Jason, yes. He says I have lots of questions. I know. Jason, I was just talking about how when we're in Susan's piece, I walk around with my notebook making a score in order to help my classical brain deal with the complexities of the cross-disciplinary collaboration. Got to know your own brain, right? That's the key to it. Do people still know the Bueller reference? I think maybe you have to be over like 35. I use it with students a lot, and they never have any idea what I'm saying. Also, FYI, making references like Radiohead is, that's like when people say, yeah, my dad likes that. That's not like not like a new hip thing anymore. All right, well, I'll talk for a few more minutes. Anybody's absolutely welcome to throw any questions anytime you want. I do like talking about this stuff. So far I've covered the idea of a composer, thank you, Emily, of a composer-performer, the more kind of traditional relationship, and making that not feel too transactional, and not being sort of backed into your respective corners of like, you do this, I do that, so, and can be so contentious sometimes, and it really doesn't have to be. We've also talked about the idea of cross-disciplinary collaboration, and how you need to kind of sometimes extend yourself a little bit out of your comfort zone in order to meet the other person where they are. And I talked briefly about how, in my mind, collaboration with a dead composer, if for lack of what should be, I think, a better way to talk about it, the idea that you bring that same mindset to a piece of fixed or classical music, and you say, well, what if this wasn't fixed? What if I could play with it and mess with it? What if I could ask the composer if I could try this a different way? What would the response be? You can't ever know the answer to that, but you can think in those terms, and then it doesn't feel so fixed. It doesn't feel so scary. It doesn't feel so like there's no room for me inside of this music. Bach, I think, is a great example. Probably the last thing to talk about, I mean, those are all kind of creative collaboration ideas. I think the last thing to talk about would be collaboration within and among yourselves, as, in our case, as an ensemble. Among the people that you're actually, as performers, making the work with. I think that the most important aspect of doing this, Christina says, some Italians are watching. Great. The most important aspect of this is that when you're all together in a group, and I've tried this, it doesn't always work. I've tried to do this in every single situation I approach, is to come to everyone with the same kind of attitude, which is like, well, we're all here to make this amazing. And so I'm essentially here for you. I remember I did this once. We were playing a gig in New York when we were still students. It was premiering a small concerto with the ACO, which is a wonderful, amazing, oh, hey, there's some questions, which is a wonderful, amazing group that does new pieces and commissions new pieces from composers. Carlos Carrillo composer wrote a concerto for us with the orchestra. It was a great experience. Everything was really great. But I remember walking into the first rehearsal, and there were a lot of freelance musicians in the group. And I remember going up to the harp player and being like, okay, in like bar 25, I have this thing and we have it together. So I'm going to look at you and we're going to try to hit this note together and it's going to be really awesome. And she was very nice, but I think didn't know what to make of it. She was like, okay, like, great, you're out there doing the thing. I'm in the orchestra. I'm going to try to play my part really well. We and I have just adopted the attitude of like, why would it ever be anything other than, hey, here we are, and here's the enthusiasm. And also, I want to be here for you, and that might mean I want to support you. It might mean I want to lead you, but in a generous way. You bring that to the table right away. A lot of you have experienced the classical music or new music thing of like, whoa, this is tense. Like, there's possibly an authoritarian like conductor or composer in the room, and you're kind of terrified to play a note, or you're in an ensemble with somebody and there's major vibe and major shade happening and you're not quite sure what to do with it. Maybe this happened, I'm sure this happens in every walk of life, but at least when I was a student 20 years ago, it was amazing to me how often situations had that feeling. And I was kind of like, why? Why does it have to be this way? What I found, and what we found, we still walk into situations where that's the default feeling in the room when you first get in. And what we found is like, you can transform those situations, not always, right? But you can transform those situations by just extending these basic kind of social intelligence things out there to other people. Like, I'm not one of those people. Like, I'm nice, or I'm here to support you, and I'm listening to your ideas, right? Like, some of this seems obvious, but you guys know that it doesn't always feel like this, right? Or maybe not even 50-50 feels like this. Maybe more than 50% it doesn't feel like this. But why not? Like, there's no good reason. So we found some situations where we come in and that vibe is there, and we're like, oh man, this person doesn't know us yet, so they don't know that it doesn't like have to be like this. And we just do our very best to be like, yeah, like, we're enthusiastic, we're there, we're trying really hard to make everything work really well. After a rehearsal, a couple of rehearsals, like, the vibe kind of cools off. And this really happens a lot. Even people who you go in and you think this is never going to change. A couple days of this positive vibe and this great energy, and it does. It changes. People relax because they're people, right? But many of those people, they grew up in this culture too. And they, at some point along the way, they got the message of like, oh, this is how you're supposed to do this for like people to take you seriously, right? Like, you have to like have this vibe, or like as a composer or conductor, like you have to assert this incredibly forceful authority all the time, or people aren't going to take you seriously. And somebody like who, if you were just like having a beer with them outside of music, might be a completely normal and interesting person, gets into this situation and you're like, whoa. Those folks, if you engage with them in a certain way, after a little bit of time, they're like, oh, I can be a normal person in this situation and we can still make really good work. I don't know. This feels like it's not specific advice, but it's like it's like gold. I mean, it really, really works. And I've seen it in our group happen time and time again. We have the advantage of there's always 4 of us coming into the room with that energy. So if we have a collaborator like a singer or a composer or a conductor, we come in with that energy. And however it starts, hopefully by the end of the first rehearsal, but maybe by the second or third rehearsal, it's kind of everybody's in a different headspace. We believe you make better work that way. So that's part of the idea of collaboration within musicians together. We do have a couple of questions. All right, Andrea and Sarek. Andrea, what's the best way to approach someone whose work you admire and haven't met with the proposition for a collaborative relationship and possible commission? That's a really great question. The first example of this, the first time this happened for us, was with the composer David Lang. We were students at Yale, and he was already quite well established and quite well known, and Bang on a Can had been around for 15-ish years at that point. And I don't know, actually the thing I was just talking about approaching situations with enthusiasm is part of it. One thing that I tell young musicians a lot is that there's a tendency to be intimidated by people who are established in your field, in this field. But you would be surprised how much your enthusiasm for somebody else's work, how far that can go, even with somebody who seems to you like they're so far along, why would they even care? Because actually the truth is, in our field, even the most famous people in new music, you know, it's still a relatively small niche within the larger culture. I mean, it's not like you're trying to like talk to Kanye, which from what I understand is such an easy thing to do even when you know him. Most of the people in our field are pretty approachable people. They're kind of music nerds who got into this because they just can't wait to get up and make music every day, write music every day. So I would say that having something specific to bring to your communication with them. I mean, enthusiasm is the first thing, but if there's an established, say, composer, you're a performer, there's an established composer that you want to approach, the first and most obvious and easy thing to do is to play some of their music or to know some of their music. And what we do with a lot of, there was a young guy at Eastman playing David Lang's piece, String of Pearls. His name is Oliver. He's a sophomore in college, playing what is the hardest piece I've ever tried playing in my life with relative ease, which completely freaked me out, in a good way. And I just told Oliver, like, you know, when you work that up and play it, like, send me the video, and I'll send it to David. And that's what we did. And he was like, okay. He played it. It sounded amazing. I sent it to David. David was like, this is amazing. Thank you, Oliver, for doing this. Thank you for sending it to me. I think that was a cool experience for the student because, oh, David Lang, you know. but actually making that connection, the amount of work that he put into David's music, David was incredibly like touched and honored and grateful by that. Almost any established composer in our field would feel that way. And actually this extends to somebody like Steve Reich. The way that we first developed our relationship with him was just by like really digging into his music and trying to have our own approach to it and just really, really working hard on it. And the first time we played it for him, he was like, hey, that's cool. Yes, I like what you're doing with it. I like how it sounds. Like, let's be in touch. So if you're a performer and there's a composer you admire and you don't know how to approach them, play the crap out of their music. I mean, that is a pretty surefire approach. And a lot of our like students who have been to SOCI make connection with a composer by learning a solo of theirs and sending them a tape. And the composer's like, that's amazing. Will you play it on this festival? Because you sound really good. You know, that's a really obvious thing. If you think of the reverse, so like maybe an ensemble like So, which has been around for a little bit, is pretty well established. Maybe you're a young composer. It's a little different because ensembles like ours, like we in particular, you know, we have a certain amount of music that we play in a year, and so we could not possibly get to all of the like scores that people send us, and it's just not exactly the way we're structured. So it's not so much something where like somebody can just send a piece and get it played by us. That's not always easy to do. But we ourselves have tried to set up, and many other ensembles and performers have done this too, structures for working through that. So we do teach at Princeton, and we work intensively with the students there. But we also have our summer program, SOCI, where we have around 8 composers every year who come. They write for us, they write for our students. We work intensively with them on that. It's somewhat competitive, but it's also a relatively accessible way, you know, for somebody to express enthusiasm, want to work with us as a younger composer and with us as a more established ensemble. But the first step is always reaching out. And we always encourage people to do that. And if you can reach out in a way that just shows your integrity and enthusiasm and your willingness to jump in the mix, very, very few people will rebuff you from that. And honestly, the people who do, you probably don't want a relationship with those people anyway. You want to work with people who have that kind of energy and enthusiasm to give back. Sarek, this is great. Andrea and Sarek were both SOCI students, so thank you guys. I appreciate the questions. He said, good morning. Can you talk about the struggles that So had in the early days of touring? How did your gear situation influence what pieces you were able to perform? How did all of those pieces fit together in a logical program? Such a good question. Sarek knows from studying with us that yes, there were struggles. There are still, but there are always struggles early on in any group. The early struggles of a percussion group are somewhat unique. There's a certain threshold of instruments that you need to have. So one of our biggest struggles is early on is that it was just a matter of pooling together our resources of instruments that we had to try to cover as much repertoire as possible. Several of us had 5-octave marimbas because we were studying with Robert Van Cise, and who was a marimbist, and so we needed to have our own marimbas to practice. A couple of us had vibraphones, tom-toms. Like all of our earliest performances when we had tom-toms, it was like everybody's high school drum set tom-toms, like different colors, different brands. I had a minivan in grad school where I was driving all of our gear around in my minivan. You know, it's whatever. It's like uphill, backwards, all of those kinds of stories. The gear thing was tricky. And so a lot of our early stuff was trying to solve logistical problems. And I mentioned that earlier when I was talking about the collaboration with Paul Lansky. That was in 2005. So that was relatively early still for us. And it was like, this is an issue for us. Like we have a certain amount of gear, and the halls that we go and play are willing to have us, but are maybe not so, sorry, notifications, are maybe not so psyched to pay a bunch of money to rent gear for us. We have to bring a lot of our own gear in my minivan. Composers were really willing to help kind of figure that out with us at that time. So we had our first loft in Brooklyn in 2004. That was when I finished grad school. We pulled all of our instruments together. We built these ridiculous shelving units. Two of us lived in the loft. And those struggles I would portray, though, as they were fun struggles, at least at that time, being like 24 years old and being like, I live in a loft in Brooklyn, and I get up in the morning, my instruments are all here. I loved that at the time. It got old after a while, but I absolutely loved it when we first started. I would say the biggest struggle we had was the idea of acceptance of percussion as a medium, as an art form. We had people say things to us, and you know, by no means were we the first percussion group, right? But it was still taking hold. We had people say to us, well, what would we do with a whole recital of all percussion music? Like maybe one piece on a program, but like a whole program of percussion music. And we had to do, Jason did the bulk of this. We had to do a lot of cajoling and kind of like reassuring. I would say part of our sort of very positive collaborative attitude comes from the fact that we were trying not to scare people. Like we never felt entitled to what we were doing, because a lot of it was that we were trying to convince people it was a good idea. So we really, really didn't want to scare people. We didn't want to scare them about all the gear. We didn't want to scare them that the aesthetic or whatever of what we were doing, or that like the music was going to be too loud or something like that. And in the end, it often was too loud. But a lot of our struggle was like gaining acceptance for it. But the beautiful thing about where we came along around 2000 was that enough of the groundwork had been laid that it was kind of the spark was, you know, was there. Like it was, the fire was ready to start. And that was because of people who came before us, right? So John Cage, when he had his ideas, it got a lot of notoriety for its novelty, but it was very difficult to sustain. He didn't have a lot of trained, or really any trained percussionists to play his music. The sort of concert hall system as it existed at that time wasn't ready for that music. So, you know, there's this 8-year period between 1935 and 1943 where all of that activity happened, and he asked all these other people to write percussion music, and a lot of stuff happened. And then it kind of, to some extent, petered out and then had to be picked up later by other people. There are these kind of fits and starts for percussion music all throughout the last 180 to 100 years. And right when we came along, it seems like enough of those kind of sparks had happened that, and of course it's not just us, there's many other wonderful groups who exist right now. Like, there were enough people that were ready for it. Steve Reich's music for us, I mean, had penetrated to a point where a lot of people were ready to hear it. And a lot of our early touring was, and still remains, his music, because it was relatively popular within our art form. And so, but we still had to do a fair bit of kind of cajoling and you know, I wouldn't say begging, but like give this a chance. A whole percussion program. And that's also one of the reasons why we started commissioning long pieces, half-hour plus pieces, is that the model we saw for chamber music of string quartets was that they had these long pieces to put on a program, and it wasn't kind of a hodgepodge. It was like this very focused thing. There was a Beethoven or a Bartok quartet on the second half of the concert, and we didn't feel like we had a lot of those. And so a lot of our commissioning focus became, let's get those pieces happening, partially as a way to solve the problem of like, how do you put together a chamber music program that makes sense within the infrastructure of chamber music as it exists right now? And frankly, like having one unified half-hour-ish piece on a second half is what other chamber music ensembles did to have long concerts. And we thought, well, okay, perhaps we need something like that in order to be a part of that world. And then this whole kind of genre of big percussion pieces, big quartets written for us came out of that situation. You had said, yeah, early days of touring, gear situation influence. Well, and I would say that the gear situation influences everything always for us. It's not just a thing in the past. And it's interesting, like we're at a point now where there are some halls, some presenters who are willing to invest in really big percussion pieces, which means money, it means gear, it means logistics. This project that we're doing right now with the singer Dawn Upshaw, the pianist Gil Kalish, and the composer Caroline Shaw. It's a program of one of George Crumb's song cycles for percussion, quartet, piano, and singer, Winds of Destiny. And Caroline Shaw wrote a brand new piece for all of us together, for the sextet together, called Narrow Sea. Beautiful pieces that work really well together. They're all American songs, American hymns, folk songs, war songs, all of these kinds of things. And, you know, the pieces kind of go together. The George Crumb piece is an enormous amount of gear. It's like 4 different gongs and 4 different bass drums and marimbas and vibraphones and practically everything you can imagine. It would have been very, very difficult for us to tour a program like that early on. With this project, we were able to get a number of people interested. There was this great consortium called Music Accord that commissioned Caroline's piece, and some of those halls, some of those presenters presented the piece, presented the program together, and they helped us get all the gear together and that kind of stuff. But, you know, the idea of logistics and percussion, I mean, there's a chicken and egg thing there where sometimes people think that a great percussion idea maybe just happened, but oftentimes there is this tension of the practical. I guess this is true in all music. There's this tension of the practical and the just purely like kind of platonic abstract headspace. And so that can actually be really fruitful. As I was mentioning earlier with the Steve Reich things, a lot of his music that works for percussion was very tourable, and it is very tourable for us as well. The George Crumb and Caroline Shaw thing is a great example of something where it's like everything we're not supposed to do in terms of, not Caroline, more of the Crumb, everything you're not supposed to do in terms of touring and logistics. It's like these super specific instruments that you like maybe use once, these huge, huge setups, but it's an unbelievable piece. It's George Crumb just being like, here I am, here's my ideas, here's what it's going to be. It's absolutely amazing. We have another question, Matthew Campbell. Was your favorite part of collaborating with the other members of So for many years? How have you grown as a quartet over time? That's a really great question. So the 4 of us specifically have been playing together for 10 years now. I've been in the group for 16 years, and it was founded just a year or 2 before that. Jason is the one person in the group now who was a founding member. It's really fun to grow over time with the same musicians when you have a good relationship, which we do. I would say if you can find people to play with who continue to surprise you and whom you can continue to admire for the qualities that they bring to the table, it can be a really fruitful relationship. A really good, I mean, I can think of examples from each other person in my group. I mean, I don't want to compliment them too much in a public forum because that'll get a little awkward, but I think actually Jason is somebody who's a good example. He has this very, very interesting skill set when it comes to the way he plays drums and the way that his brain and body works with coordination and with processing number patterns, which is very different than the way my brain and body works. I've almost, for the past 16 years, been trying to figure it out. I'm never going to fully figure it out because I don't work the same way. But he kind of has this ability to think of layers of numbers and put them into his body, and he composes that way too. The students that we've had at Bard, he gives them a whole semester of drum set where I think they're like, okay, I'm going to study drum set now, but it's actually just these increasingly difficult kind of labyrinthine coordination puzzles that have to do with polyrhythms and number combinations and number layers. And I think it's pretty hard. I think a lot of them are like a little bit shell-shocked by it, but it's really, really great too. Seeing the way that he writes music over the years as influenced by the way his brain works has been really interesting for me. And it's always something I have to sort of get inside because it's not completely native for me the way that my brain works. Another example, Josh within our group is a steel drum player, and that's had a profound influence on the way that he makes music and thinks about music. It's really interesting for me to play in a percussion quartet with him. And, you know, we've got this overlap of skill sets that we use together within the percussion quartet. And then I see him teaching a steel band, and I'm like, what? You do this whole other thing, at this level of mastery, and it's completely foreign to me. I can't play a C scale on a steel pan. And it's so compelling and it's so interesting, and it's this whole other tradition. And, you know, with Eric too, I mean, he has this history with using technology, and he used to be a recording major at Peabody, and he has this ways of putting instrument combinations together and stuff like that. You kind of keep discovering each other along the way at the same time that you have an overlap of skills that you're constantly honing. Like we have to have a unified sense of time and sense of ensemble and things like that when we play together. But our differences are interesting to us too. And maybe kind of the last thing I'll talk about, I was planning on this being about an hour, and thank you guys so much for those of you who had questions. One of the biggest ways that we've grown as a quartet is we've branched out a lot in terms of how we think of the percussion quartet and its possibilities. And specifically, I mean things like cross-genre collaborations or cross-disciplinary collaborations. Writing music ourselves, that's actually something I didn't even really talk about. I could briefly talk about the fact that that was something that started very slowly when Jason first started writing the music that became Amid the Noise, was when we first started writing for ourselves as an ensemble. That creates a completely different dynamic within the group of now we're the creators and the performers, and we're now collaborating with each other, the four of us, in the midst of all of that. Hi. And so... sorry, your question. Oh, yeah, how we've grown. So we've grown from, when we started out, it was, we are a percussion quartet. We play new music by composers, which means probably somebody who has a degree in composition. And I think that's actually okay when you first start to be pretty specific about defining yourself, because it helps people get a kind of grasp on what you are and who you are. And for a while it was like, that's who we are, that's what we do. We kind of, our specialty is like being really good at this and seeking out people who are really good at writing music, and that's the thing. And over time, part of it was living in New York, part of it was just kind of getting out of school into the real world, adult world or whatever, and realizing that like there aren't actually any rules. This is completely up to us how we want to do this. And part of it was just some of the people we ran into. We started to be like, well, percussion isn't a thing. Percussion is not really a genre, and it's not a niche, and it's not even a specialization. It's more of this kind of umbrella. It's like a catch-all concept for, if you think of us in the back of the orchestra, right? We are people who hit stuff. But actually, we're not only people who hit stuff. So if you have car horns, right, like Gershwin, the analogy we use all the time in classes is you're not going to hand the car horns to the horn section, right? Well, why not? It's a horn. Because that's not what they do. That's what we do. You give us something and we don't really know what to do with it, and we figure it out from there. And so more and more we started to think, well, and Bryce's piece is a good example of this. It's the string instruments. They're not percussion instruments. Percussion is not a thing. Percussion is a state of mind. Now, it's a little bit facetious because, yes, we do all have to study certain skills, and we're basically playing with sticks most of the time. But it's a state of mind, and it's an umbrella for curiosity, for exploration, for collaboration, for all of these kinds of concepts. And so we met people from outside of our world. Very early on, we worked with the group Matmos, who are unbelievable musicians with different training, different skill sets than what we grew up with. They don't work off of notation. When we started working together, I had this kind of amazing moment of like, these are two of the most widely read, most interesting people that I've ever met who are also amazing musicians. They make music differently than I do. So what are my two options here? I can sort of put up a wall. We've been talking about walls a lot lately in our culture, right? I can put up some kind of barrier between me and them and say, I do this, you do that. I can also say, well, maybe there's something for us to find together here. I'll tell one last story about that was really illustrative for me. I was in a car with Martin Schmidt. We were touring. We had first started doing some stuff together. Poor Martin. I was fresh out of school. And this must have just been for, I can't imagine what this was like for him, but we were in the car and I think I was talking about Beethoven, and he was super interested in what I was talking about Beethoven. He wanted to know all about it. And I said, well, okay, like, let's just start from square one. Like, what is it? What's your Beethoven? Like, where does it start for you? And he said, well, I mean, obviously there's Kraftwerk. And I was like, uh-huh, what's that? And he was like, what? What are you talking about? And I was like, yeah, Kraftwerk, tell me about that. Like, what is that? And there was such an amazing moment between, well, at least it was an amazing moment for me. It might have been horrifying for him. He was like, oh, okay. So really square one. Okay, here's square one. And he started playing all this music for me. And so I had finished basically a doctorate at that point, like most of it, studying Beethoven, Bartók, all of this kind of stuff. I did not know who Kraftwerk was. And it's okay. You don't have to know what everything is. But in order to understand Martin and Drew and Matmos and the music that they were making, having heard Kraftwerk at some point would actually be pretty important. And he was like, okay, let's listen, so Computer World and all of this kind of stuff. And I was like, oh, I've heard a lot of stuff like this. He was like, yeah, because it started with guys like this, and then other people were influenced by that. But so my education in some ways started all over again after school by running into people who came from a different place and had a different frame of mind and a different way of working within music. So we as an ensemble chose to embrace those experiences as often as possible and tried not to push them away. And we came to believe over time that whatever your kind of core skill set, your core characteristics that you bring to the table, there's nothing about embracing what you're learning from other people that has to threaten that basic thing that you bring. If you've really worked on it, if you really have that craft, it's not going anywhere. If you run into somebody who enjoys and admires that craft that you have, but who themselves bring something different to the table, you can learn things from each other, and you can say, well, here's something about what I bring to the table. But there's no reason for you to feel threatened or insecure by the idea that other musicians or other artists bring a different way of thinking to the table, a different way of working to the table. That's probably been the toughest for me, is being in a situation where people work really differently, right? Like, I spent all of this time in conservatory learning how to play in large ensembles, learning how to interpret scores and read music and learn music really fast. This whole skill set. And then I feel like, okay, so people just let me do that now because I'm really good at that. Getting into situations where somebody's like, we're improvising now. I need you to learn this by rote. That was a really hard one for me. Jason had studied in Bali and Josh had studied steel drums, where there's a lot of rote learning. And they were like, yeah, absolutely, let's go for it. And I was like, white knuckle, But over time, I sort of figured out how to do it. This is all something that along the way you can grow. You can grow in this direction of like keeping a handle on your core competency, your core craft that you bring to the table, and embracing what other people are bringing to the table as well. Okay, I think I'm going to leave on that note. A little over an hour. Yeah, this is great. This was really fun to sit in a room and just talk for a long time. I really enjoyed doing this. If any of you guys enjoyed this, let us know. We'd like to do more of these. We'll get different people in the group up to talk about different stuff. We may do these once a month. We may do them more often. Maybe you can just let us know. And if you think of more questions, you can put them in the comments. I can try to answer them. Some people tuned in. Thank you guys so much for doing that. Yeah, you're welcome, Matthew. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And I hope we'll see you sometime. Bye-bye.